I'm your host, Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Race Through the States. This weekly political podcast is giving you the rundown on election 2024, a presidential race that won't soon be forgotten once it's all said and done. I'm joined on this first episode by Dr. Melissa Miller, professor of political science at Bowling Green State University. Now, we've done many interviews together, but at this point in the race, there is a lot to discuss, from the political polarization to the fact that both sides can't seem to hold each other accountable anymore. Here's our conversation. I guess we can first start out with the fact that Ohio is back in the national spotlight because we already lost all of our attention because we're not a swing state, but we're back in the news over the Springfield, Ohio situation. And I kind of wanted to gauge what your reaction was to Governor Mike DeWine, because he was on ABC News, he was on This Week. One of the things, though, that stuck out from the interview, though, was that he was really pushing for former President Trump to stay on the issues.
Right. And in fact, we have Republican elected officials in Springfield also sort of trying to turn the spotlight away from Springfield and explaining that the claims that were made about Haitian immigrants are unfounded. I think the Governor DeWine asking Donald Trump to stay on the issue is it's just a different way of saying, please, let's not draw any more attention to Springfield. Yes, I think there are elected officials that, of course, saying, yes, the schools are crowded in Springfield, but that's what happens when companies and an economy grows. So I think particularly on the Republican side, in the case of Mike DeWine, I think the situation and the rumors that are unfounded regarding Springfield prompted Mike DeWine to try to say, please stay on the issues, Donald Trump. There are other high-level elected Republican officials, Lindsey Graham. There are other high-ranking Republican elected officials also asking for Donald Trump to stay on the issues. And one of the things is that there are Republicans on the ballot, up and down the ballot, running, lower down on the ballot with Donald Trump at the top. So we are beginning to see some Republicans, and I think, part of it is their self-interest. They don't want Donald Trump to turn off independent voters or more moderate voters because they too are hoping to get those independent or moderates to vote for them as Republicans, whether that's for, town council or mayor or city council or state legislature or what have you. So we've continued to hear sort of that drumbeat, but I do think that Donald Trump, right, he writes his own score, and I don't anticipate there will be a lot of change. He's a creature of habit, and he tends to make statements that are, can be offensive to people. And I don't think we'll see a change between now and November. And I think Republicans are worried about that.
And I can imagine that the big frustration is the fact that we have a lot of polling data that shows that there are two very big issues that Republicans perform well on that he hasn't really talked about as much. Of course, the economy as well as immigration. Those two issues are not issues that Democrats do well with at all.
That's absolutely right. Democrats tend to do well if reproductive rights, right. Among voters who prioritize reproductive rights, Democrats really do well. But on the top, I would say two of the top three issues, as you point out, economy and immigration, that's where Donald Trump continues to lead. That's pre-debate, that's post-debate. That was when he was running against Joe Biden. That's now when he's running against Kamala Harris. So he just seems to appeal to voters. And I don't know that it's because he's talking in real plain terms about the economy and immigration. In the most recent example, there is some fear mongering that's happening, but I do think the Harris campaign, and I think we saw this in the debate last week when asked, whether do you think people are better off now than they were 4 years ago? That was the Harris Kamala Harris didn't seem to have a really ready to go response to that question. And so, Donald Trump continues to lead. And here's the thing, We know from loads of political science research that there is pocketbook voting. That's a really fancy political science term, right? But it's the idea and the theory backed up by lots of evidence over the years that voters tend to vote based on the economy and how they, how they feel they're doing in their personal financial situation. Now, here's the thing, Jaden. There are the stock market's at a record high. There's been a decrease in unemployment. So on some of the indicators, it would appear that the economy is doing well, but people in the polls are not feeling it. They're not suggesting that they're feeling it, and they're feeling some economic anxiety. And I think that always, if there's economic anxiety out there, the party of the sitting president tends to get blamed. So part of that is what we're seeing in this election. So I do think the Harris campaign needs to sharpen the message. And I think they have been trying to do that. And, your listeners will, recall it was just a short while ago when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket. So there's been a lot of changes, but I think that's one thing. If I could give advice to the Harris campaign, it would be to sharpen the message on economy and immigration. And if I could give advice to the Trump team, it would be to stick to the policy issues.
And we've been hearing for years that it always comes down to pocketbook issues, because one thing Americans are not putting near the top has been something else, which is foreign policy. But one thing we have seen, though, is some frustration within the Democratic Party, specifically between younger members of the party and then more senior members of the party with regard to the war in Gaza, which has been a big point of contention. And we even saw this come up at the DNC, where there were some frustrations that people didn't get to speak about this at the convention. And so kind of speak to that, because we're starting to see more party infighting on both sides, because Democrats, obviously the war in Gaza, and then you have Republicans who are fighting over the economy and staying on that message.
Right. And there's disagreement within the Republican Party in terms of Ukraine and the extent to which the United States still should continue supporting Ukraine. So, but you're absolutely right. We have decades of research suggesting that unless we have U.S. troops in combat, or if it's a post 9/11 environment attacked on our home soil, but sort of like when the lives of U.S. troops are not on the line, and let me just say that if those who serve in the military, in some cases, troops are killed even if we're not at war. And I think the Republicans, for instance, at the Republican National Convention this year, were very effective in their messaging about the messy withdrawal from Afghanistan and the lives lost by those serving the military. But let's go back to the point you raised, which is, for the most part, yes, there are two major wars in Gaza and in the Ukraine, but the U.S. is not directly involved. We're indirectly involved. And so if we got directly involved, I think foreign policy would shoot right to the top, right, it would be a top two issue for sure, right up there with the economy. But Americans tend to not focus on foreign policy and not vote based on foreign policy in presidential elections unless we are in a situation where U.S. troops are in combat. Now, having said that, one of the concerns, and let's take the example, that doesn't mean that foreign policy will have no influence, because thinking about it this way, this election is so close. It's like on a knife's edge, right? It could go either way, according to all the polls. And, I'll say this about the polls. I wouldn't put too much stock in any one individual poll, but across the battleground states, we're seeing that there's no clear leader, that in repeated polls is outside of the margin of error. So the polls agree on this fact that it's very close. So then where does foreign policy come into play? Well, you mentioned young voters within the Democratic Party unhappy with the Biden administration's policy and support for Israel, and vocal support, and disappointment, and that, the Palestinian voice is not being heard, that there hasn't been a ceasefire, and so forth. And so the risk for the Democrats, I don't think, is that young voters are going to vote for Donald Trump and vote for Republicans up and down the ballot. Some might do that, but I think the bigger risk is they just don't bother to vote because they don't like their options. And so in an election that is this close, turnout is absolutely positively vital, and both sides have to turn out their base and then hope for the best among the independents and the moderates, because this race could go either way. So each of them is, now one thing Donald Trump does, and arguably very effectively, is speak to his base, so much so appealing to the base. And we see this very visibly at his rallies, where he really gets those rally goers, excited and riled up and very enthusiastic. But for him, the problem is that success he has in rallying the base may not be enough if independent and moderates turn out for Kamala Harris and the Democrats. So I would, focus on what might turnout be, who's going to not only mobilize their base, but mobilize, people who maybe aren't real thrilled, but they get off the couch and they get to the polls. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, you can see there's definitely a lot of effort being put in that area, because even my phone has been blown up with texts, and I'm not even a voter yet. So they definitely
there you go.
They're blowing the budget on the phone messaging. So maybe they need to tame it down a bit. But I mean, that's a big thing, though. I think what you said about younger voters it's pretty true, because they were not enthusiastic about the war in Gaza and potentially having President Biden serve 4 more years on that issue. And now we've seen that there is some people that are definitely feeling the same way still after the candidates have switched, because they're looking at the current policy. Now, Vice President Harris, she has called for a ceasefire, but for a lot of people, they're kind of looking at the situation now, and they don't exactly see the fact that this U.S. relationship has been around so long. They really just see it for the humanitarian crisis that it's become.
And indeed, it is a humanitarian crisis. I think this issue is part of a larger challenge for Kamala Harris, which is she's trying to run as the outsider. And yet she's the sitting vice president. So she is the, not only next in line, but like the second, official in the executive branch, right under the president himself. So in normal circumstances, she's the incumbent. And so, voters will associate a sitting vice president with whatever the policies are, the successes, the failures of the sitting president. Now, the reason she's trying to run as an outsider is in part because not everyone is feeling that the Biden administration, on Gaza, as you point out, there's disagreement within the Democratic Party. There are people who think the Biden economic policies haven't worked for them. And so she's trying to find that distance between herself and President Biden while still serving as vice president. Now, what's the wild card in all this? She's not running against any Republican nominee. She's running against a Republican nominee who's also a former president. And so voters have had experience and are in the process right now of evaluating Kamala Harris / the Biden administration, as well as the former administration of Donald Trump. So sort of like, who's the incumbent in this situation? Who do voters treat as the incumbent? They have experience with both the Biden and Harris administration and with the Trump administration. And so who's the incumbent? Now, Kamala Harris is trying to thread that needle, and she's trying to campaign as the outsider. And I think she's had some success in doing that, right? I think she is trying to get some daylight between her and some of President Biden's policies. But she also needs, he was just the nominee, right? And like, there were people who didn't think Joe Biden should step down, right? And some real loyal Biden supporters that, she wants to kind of keep in the fold. So she's trying to thread a needle, and it all hinges on, is this going to be a referendum on The Democratic Party, I have someone knocking at my door. I'm so sorry.
You're fine.
Is this going to be a referendum on the Democratic Party, or is it a referendum on Donald Trump? And that's the question.
What's interesting also, though, is to see how states like Ohio are playing out. I saw something that was pretty odd because there is some advertising that the Harris-Walz campaign is doing in Toledo, Ohio. And it's about weirder to see that in Toledo, Ohio than it would be to see it in Toledo, Spain.
Yeah, here's the thing. The Harris-Walz campaign hadn't bought any advertising in Ohio, all right? But they've had a huge fundraising success since Kamala Harris came to the top of the ticket. So they've enjoyed a lot of fundraising success. And so the campaign, flush with cash, okay, can now spend it in states that aren't necessarily the ones that will decide, like Pennsylvania. Everyone seems to be in agreement. It is a battleground state. There are those seven states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and I'm missing one. But you get the idea, right? Those are the states that will decide the election. Well, it recently, this was a week or two ago, but it came out that the Harris-Walz campaign was buying ads in Toledo and Youngstown. Clever me. I thought, oh, you know what? There's, these are sort of like towns that have a strong union presence. And so, oh yeah, I can, I thought to myself, oh, I can see why they'd pick Toledo and Youngstown. Then I had a colleague, David Jackson, Dr. David Jackson in the political science department at BGSU, who said that what he saw was the Harris-Walz campaign was buying advertising in Toledo. So why? Because the Toledo media market reaches Southeast Michigan. Yes. So it's kind of like you buy that advertising in the Toledo market, and viewers in Southeast Michigan will see it, and that's the audience. It's kind of like, you know what? And if you pick up votes in Ohio, great. Same with Youngstown. That Youngstown media market spills over. And residents of Western Pennsylvania are now seeing that advertising. And I thought that was really interesting. Normally, we were always the state where huge ad buys in all of our media markets: Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Toledo, Dayton, Youngstown, right? But since we're not considered a battleground state anymore, we hadn't really seen a lot. Now, here's the thing. That advertising in a close election, right? It is very, very important. But I'll tell you what else is important: the social media campaign. And particularly for your generation, and my generation, right? But for those who are on social media, that's where there's been a tremendous campaign. And that's where Kamala Harris and Tim Walz seem to have a little edge in that social media campaign. But we'll see. Now, one thing I want to point out is Donald Trump in 2016, some of your listeners will recall, and there were some pundits and political scientists, by the way, who observed Donald Trump's successful bid for the presidency in 2016 and his win, and they called it the Twitter campaign. He so effectively used Twitter in 2016. So what we often see in these presidential campaigns, one candidate really, has the edge in whatever that latest technology is, or that latest app that everybody loves. All right.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw Donald Trump and his campaign do on Twitter. And in 2024, we're seeing the Harris-Walz campaign do this across a number of media outlets, but Instagram, for instance, and really seem to have a knack for getting memes to go viral, right? And there can be positive memes and negative memes, by the way. Not all, right? Not all memes are a good thing necessarily for a campaign, but they seem to have done, or they seem to be doing well on the social media. Now, will it be decisive? We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
The people who watch television news tend to skew older, while the people who get all of their news from social media tend to skew younger. So it's two different audiences.
It really is. And the thing is, you also notice for the older audience that they're definitely more so focused on bringing down the temperature. That's kind of been a big thing that their campaign has been running with was basically, remember this, well, we're going to be more behind the scenes. Is that actually a strategy that can be effective in this election?
Well, here's the thing. There have now been not one, but two assassination attempts against the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. And so there was a big call to lower the temperature after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania.
For 2 days, it seemed, and then things are right back to normal.
It didn't seem to last very long. Now there's a second assassination attempt at Trump International Golf Course in South Florida. And again, we have the calls to lower the temperature. We started, a few minutes ago, we're talking about foreign policy. One thing that I think is interesting is some international leaders are, after two assassination attempts, you're beginning to hear the British Prime Minister, for instance, saying, I'm concerned about what will happen in November, right? This isn't going to end well, sort of thing. Yeah. And I think part of that is, we have seen political violence in this country. And we did see an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Now, two assassination attempts within, I'm not sure the number of weeks, but within 2 months, right? We've seen two assassination attempts. And I think there are European leaders, Latin American leaders, I think sort of the world is watching, and they are just as aware as you and I and your listeners are. This race could go either way.
Right.
And the concern is that the losing side may not, accept the result. There may not be not just a peaceful transfer of power, but there could be big protests. We'll see. I don't want to be fear mongering here, but at the same time, it is a high stakes election. It's getting a lot of international attention. It's not only high stakes, it's very close. And we've begun to see, right, sort of the rhetoric that's being used is right. There are references to violent acts and so forth, and it's potentially very, very worrisome.
Yeah, the situation, just looking and seeing about all the different events that have unfolded, and then we've even had some much smaller events that have unfolded that maybe didn't make national news, but we are seeing that violence, and it does happen, especially when we have a race that's so tight and a country that's so polarized.
That's right. And in fact, turning back for a minute to Springfield, Ohio, with the false claims by the former president that Haitian immigrants were eating domestic animals, abducting and eating domestic animals, Republican officials at the local level and have basically, have tried to make it very clear this isn't happening and please stop saying this, it's not true. What we've seen there, the schools having to shut down because of multiple bomb threats, colleges having to shut down that are in and around Springfield because of threats of violence and so forth. So, these are, it's real. These threats of violence are a real thing that now we are coping with. And we haven't seen that sort of thing in past elections, right? In January 6th happened after the 2020 election, but I'm saying sort of like in my lifetime, this is definitely a very recent thing that dates to sort of, January 6th, 2021, in terms of people acting on violence. And frankly, there's been, there have been threats to other and people, and it's just that it just seems to be up a notch.
Yeah. The volume is very loud. That's the big thing.
That's right.
I think that's why you see so many people trying to tune out from it, because there used to be a norm of both could respect each other, they could coexist. You definitely are running a race here with two polar opposite candidates, and it seems like there's no overlap. And I think it definitely is setting a bad example for the country, where we're definitely having this tone of neither of us can win or something's going to go horribly wrong.
There was a lot of research done. This is like 1990s, early 2000s. There was research done in political science about polarization, about party polarization. And what that research found was actually the public was not very polarized.
No.
Average American voters were not really very polarized, okay? Most Americans were in the middle. And the polarization that you did find 80s, 90s, early 2000s was elites, political elites, right? Tended to be, if you were an elected official and you were a Democrat, you were further to the left than the average Democrat. If you were an elected official and you were a Republican, you were further to the right than the average Republican. That research no longer holds. Now we have found that the polarization has absolutely manifest within the electorate itself. And so you have people who, right, like if they hear something positive about the other party, they discount it. They don't believe it, right? They don't believe it because they're looking at it through a blue lens if they're a Democrat, or through a red lens if they are a Republican. And the elected officials themselves, knowing how polarized the electorate is, and wanting to win re-election, and depending on, there's so few competitive legislative districts, House, U.S. House districts or state legislative districts. That has to do with the redistricting process and partisan gerrymandering, which is a problem in many, many states. But those elected officials want to get reelected. Well, if they're in a safe red, state or a safe red legislative district, then all they have to do is win their party's primary. Well, how do you win the party's primary? If you're a Democrat, it tends to be, there's sometimes exceptions, but it tends to be the most liberal Democrat will win and the most conservative Republican will win. So it is kind of like then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, and that makes it hard to govern. It turns people off to politics. It makes compromise, impossible, because voters, who are real hardcore supporters of their party tend to reward the candidates of their party who don't compromise with the other side.
And on top of all of that, it just makes conversations like the one we're having now difficult to have, because you're talking to an audience that has consumed so much of their own side to the point where you're just having an objective conversation and the audience is trying to guess, is this liberal? Is this conservative?
Right. And that's where the work that you do, Jaden, is so important. And I think that unfortunately, there's many people who are skeptical about the media. Okay. And that is driven in part because people are sitting in their media silo, right? Yeah. So if they're conservative, they're getting the news only from conservative outlets. Or if they're liberal, they're getting it only from liberal outlets. And that, they live in what's called an echo chamber, right?
Yes.
The political scientists would say this is an echo chamber. So you have these opinions and then you watch the media, and the media reinforces your opinion because you're selectively choosing to watch a liberal media outlet that's specifically liberal. And we can point to, for instance, on the liberal side, MSNBC on cable news, on the conservative side, Fox News, and just as two examples. And people live in those media silos, and so they really don't hear the other side, as much as would be helpful, right? And like I said, I think that's where the work that you do is important, right? That's, just about analysis and facts and what's happening and what are the implications.
I do appreciate that, because I think we oftentimes, that tends to be a thing in this country now. And it's just, you can remember looking back at past elections, obviously the last couple presidential elections I was on the scene to cover, but you definitely notice there is that difference. And I think that it also leaves less room for each party to criticize itself, because there used to be a time when it wasn't a bad thing to hold your own party accountable. But now we don't see that. when one party doesn't hold itself accountable, then the other decides it doesn't have to.
Right. So, that is the world we live in. And here's the thing, and I don't mean to be a downer here, but it's hard to see how we break out of the cycle. Honestly,
Yes.
it's hard to see how we break out of this cycle because, as I said, so many legislative seats, whether that's in state legislatures or whether that's in Congress, they're predetermined because the district has been drawn using gerrymandering so that it is a blue district that no doubt will elect a Democrat, or it's a red district that no doubt will elect a Republican. And so then the competition is all in the primary. And frankly, if you're the incumbent, let's say, member of Congress, and you're not sufficiently conservative, you're likely to get, face a primary challenge within your own party and possibly lose in the next time, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're not sufficiently liberal, right? So the system, the way it works, the effect, the implication of all that is that we are in a self-fulfilling prophecy of further polarization, I'm afraid.
Yes, and that's what makes covering the election so tiring. And then for the viewer, it's tiring to hear about it all the time. But at the end of the day, though, it's something.
Yeah, and here's one thing I'll say. So I it sounds like I don't have so a lot of positive, right, things to say about but let me say this: one really normally very good thing about a close election, it drives turnout. Okay. So turnout, and we know this from decades of research, tends to go up, first of all, in presidential election years, because voters really get excited about voting for president. That's always been true, right? Turnout is the highest if there's a presidential election at the top of the ballot. That's been true for decades. Then you combine that with the race could go either way. It's going to be close, okay? Voters feel like I could make a difference. Or, because we know in presidential elections, it's not the popular vote that determines the outcome, but it's the electoral college.
Correct.
And so we also see that in battleground states, turnout is a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So when it's close, and certainly if you live in a battleground state, turnout tends to be driven up because people think maybe, I could make a difference. It really matters, right? I think I better make sure I, cast my vote early, or, oh boy, the polls are about to close. I've got, a half hour, got to race over to the precinct and vote, right? And when it's close, they'll turn out. The problem is if the outcome is very close, right? In terms of thinking about the November, like election day in 2024. And as we get the results, which I think there's a good probability we won't know the winner on election night, okay? Because 50 states have to count ballots and count absentee ballots and take account of early voting. And all 50 states, they control their own election processes. That's why we see like some states offer lengthier periods of early voting. Some states it's shorter. Some states have vote by mail and make that more readily available to voters. Others less so. It's because states themselves and those state legislatures, they write the election law. And so it's complicated, right? Then to hold a federal election, because 50 states have their own processes, and we might not know right away. And I think people need to be prepared to be patient. Okay.
Yes.
Here's the problem. We're highly polarized. Passions are running high, right? I don't think people are going to be real patient, and particularly if it's a very close, it comes down, which many are predicting, it will come down to, it could come down to less than 10,000 votes across 6-7 states, right?
Wow.
And the concern is that there could be violence. There could, this could get worse before it gets better. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Worse before it gets better. So we'll see. But I do I like to see high turnout. I just generally believe in, and part of it is just, it's always interested me, right? I was socialized in the 1980s. I'm not going to give my age, Jaden, but like, I've seen a lot of elections, right? I sound like a real old time. But I think I just have that patriotism, right? That was instilled in me, right? That right to vote. And I carry it with me today. So, that's one thing. I think hopefully people will get out there, because, again, it could go either way. So I hope your listeners in Ohio, or if they're in another state, check your state for when the deadline is. In Ohio, it's October 7th to register to vote, with early voting beginning on October 8th. So these are things to keep in mind. And your listeners, I'm sure, are likely to be the ones that want to make sure they cast that ballot. And I say, regardless of where you are on that political spectrum, be part of the process, be part of the democratic process.
See, and that's even a silver lining that a pessimist like me can get behind, because all I'm seeing is my fellow older, more experienced Americans have issues that someone my age would not have. So if anything, that is a good thing.
Traditionally, what we say is that the higher the turnout, the more legitimate the outcome, right? So what you don't want, let's imagine, and this is outlandish, right? This would not happen. But let's say only 10% of the electorate turned out in a given election, right, to vote for president. We wouldn't then look at that elected president and say, boy, that is a legit, boy, did that person has a mandate. Boy, they are really backed by the American people, right? So you don't want a 10% turnout. You want as high of a turnout as you get, because conceptually that should lead to greater legitimacy, right? That is then afforded whoever wins. The difference we're seeing today is that in the world in which we live, okay, there are already people, there's been a lot of doubt cast about the legitimacy of the vote and early voting. I think Monday it'll start in some states. But on the Republican side, we've seen Donald Trump, and he did this in 2020 as well, but sort of saying, if I don't win, then it will be because of trickery and cheating, right? Now, here's the thing. We live in a state in which Republicans control all statewide executive office, including Secretary of State. In Ohio, actually, we are considered really the gold standard, right? We are considered, and we have been under Democratic and Republican secretaries of state, that we really know how to run elections, right? And we're not a state where there were a lot of, allegations that, people were voting who weren't allowed to. So, it'll definitely be interesting to see if there are allegations, right? Number one, whether there's any evidence. There just isn't in past presidential elections evidence of widespread voter fraud. And whether, I very much doubt we'd see that. I think one of the interesting things is if there are allegations of voter fraud, sometimes it'll even be within the red state where the election is run by the Republican, right? A Republican elected official who's, usually it's called Secretary of State, right? Somebody who administers the elections. So we shall see. Things to watch for.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting next how many ever days we have, because I think
agree.
No matter what happens on November 5th, a lot of the people like you and I, we will just be sleeping. We're going to need some sleep. We're going to need a nap before, because we've been in the trenches for the last few months. And so we're going to be glad when this is all over. To me, it's
like some people are just, they want to see every game of their favorite sports team, right? Whether it's college football, NFL, NBA, hockey, right? They are the super fans. And I'm sort of a super fan of elections and trying to explain and understand. And I don't like to do a lot of predictions, it's getting harder and harder, to be honest with you, to predict election outcomes. Why?
It
Because
is.
the polling is getting so much harder to do in an era where everybody has caller ID. And
Yes.
so few people have landlines anymore. And it just makes it so difficult to get a representative sample. So I would caution your listeners, when looking at the polls, first of all, forget the national polls if you're interested in the presidential election. Don't even pay attention. The national polls absolutely matter not. Because according to our Constitution, we don't elect the president based on the national popular vote. We elect based on the Electoral College vote, which is, of course, that number of votes each state gets according to the size of its congressional delegation. And then, as you and I talked about earlier, then the campaigns themselves zero in. They don't campaign across all 50 states. Why spend money if you're a Republican campaigning in California when California will certainly, right, give all their Electoral College votes to the Democrat? And vice versa, for the Democratic candidate, why would they put all their money in a deep red state like South Carolina? They're not going to do that. It doesn't make sense. They put their money in those battleground states. And so I think when you're looking at the polls or you're trying to get a handle on how close is the race, who's likely to win, we're all doing, a lot of people are doing that, honestly, right? Even those who aren't like you and me, sort of like the super fans, right? Political types. But just, ignore everything but the polls that you see that are reputable, coming out of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. That's where you need to focus your attention. And then don't just look at one poll. Go to a clearinghouse, like Real Clear Politics is a good one, where what they have is folks who really are kind of screening, right? So they're not reporting the poll results from the fly-by-night polling organization, right?
Right.
They're looking at the methodology to make sure it's sound. And the maybe not the last thing I'll say about polls, but one thing to keep in mind: the pollsters actually want to get it right.
Yes.
The pollsters actually, they love it if they accurately, right? If their methodology was so sound that they actually, now this far out, I'm not sure, right? Things can change, right? There can be a big shift, right? Something could happen on the world stage. Something could happen that puts Americans at risk. So there can be things. There could be an October surprise, right? So things could shape up the election. So it's a little early to say, oh, this is the prediction for the outcome, right? But as we get very close, the pollsters really are trying to get it right. Here's the problem. The pollsters are trying to get a sample that is representative of who ultimately will end up voting. Now, the pollsters, they want the right proportion of Democrats, the right proportion of Republicans, the right proportion of independents and women and men and various ethnicities and so on and so forth. But we don't know, sitting here today, who's going to end up turning out to vote. We don't know, sitting here today, what should the appropriate percent of Democrats be in a given poll, or the appropriate percent of Republicans, or the appropriate percent of young voters. We won't know until after the election who actually turned out to vote, and then we'll know what the percentages should be for each of those categories. And so right now, the pollsters trying to get a representative sample. They're trying to get a representative sample of a population that will ultimately know that population of voters after the fact. And we just don't know. It's a lot going to be about turnout. So it's very difficult for polling. I'm not saying don't look at them, but certainly focus your attention on the battleground state polls, and look at the broad trends rather than, oh, my candidate is up by 1%, therefore they're winning the state. No, they're within the margin of error. That is too close to call. There is some error when you're polling, in a state, it's not like science, there is some science involved, but there's also a great deal of art. It's both an art and a science. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you have to be honing in on those battleground states just as much as the campaigns are putting all their money into them, because not everybody,
That's right.
I mean, I like to tell people every voice matters because every voice does matter, but some states do matter a bit more. And that is the reality of our system.
It's the reality of the system. And it's interesting because we're recording this podcast on Constitution Day. So today is Constitution Day, which is a federal holiday, but as one of my colleagues said earlier today, it's not one of the fun ones, right? It's not one where, families get together for a barbecue, right? There aren't parades and fireworks and that sort of thing. But it is Constitution Day, where we mark the day as one honoring the U.S. Constitution. And the Constitution is where we get the Electoral College. And, every 4 years there are calls that, we should be like other democracies, and just do the national popular vote. But we abide by that Constitution, and it is the Electoral College. And here's the thing, as you point out, because we have that Electoral College, that's where the campaigns focus all their attention, their time, their money. That's where, in reality, it does mean that, a voter sitting in Ohio has less influence on the outcome than a voter sitting in Pennsylvania. Yeah. All right. It didn't used to be that way. We used to be the picker of presidents. So battleground state status can shift over time as demographics shift. And that's what we've seen. That, Ohio used to be considered a pretty good microcosm of the national electorate. Now, demographically, we don't have that, we're not kind of a really good proxy for the national electorate, and other states demographically are closer to the national electorate, but most importantly, other states are more evenly split. And so they could go either way, and that's where the campaigns put their focus.
Right. And ironically, it's just north of us that the national spotlight is at. It's Michigan is another big state. And so Ohioans probably would have never predicted that. But in the battle of Ohio versus Michigan, in terms of elections, one has won, and it's Michigan.
That's right. That's right. And any listeners who remember, right? I think you go back to 2012, 2016. Yes, we were still considered a battleground state. But if you go back to 2008, 2012, some of your older listeners, go back further than that, right? Go back to 2004, right? Go back to 2000, keep going back, go all the way back, frankly, to 1960. And Ohio picked the winner in terms of who won a majority. Whichever candidate won a majority in Ohio, all the way back to 1960, won the White House. Okay. That changed, in 2020 when Joe Biden won, but Ohio cast its electoral college votes for Donald Trump because Donald Trump won the state of Ohio by an 8-point margin. And so sort of our record there was broken. So some listeners, we used to be the Pennsylvania of presidential elections, right?
Yeah.
Where, oh my gosh, we had presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates during the fall campaign coming and speaking on the Bowling Green State University campus, right? So if you need your fix, right, of campaign rallies and lots of advertising and that sort of thing, just drive north, drive over the state line.
Or east.
And Michigan is playing that role now. And so are 6 other states, as I've mentioned.
I look forward to catching up with you again because I know for a fact it usually unfolds this way. There's always a major news event. And so it's going to be something.
And I look forward to talking to you again, Jaden. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. And I appreciate you and the listeners for joining me for the first episode of Race Through the States, or more specifically, Race Through the Battleground States. You've been listening to Race Through the States, a podcast production of Jaden Jefferson Report Studios. Thanks for listening.